Right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Journey of the Soul, a fresh look at life, death, and the rest in peace. When we concluded last week's class, we kind of left it with a bit of a cliffhanger. The topic last week was to explore the Jewish perspective on life and death. And what did we say? We said that life is not defined by the body. Rather, life is defined by the soul. The soul existed before it entered our body. The soul will continue to exist after it leaves our body because the soul is eternal. The soul is life itself. What this means is that when a person passes away, death is not the end of life. Rather, it's the end of the body being animated by the soul, but the soul continues to live on in a new state and a new dimension. And this leaves us with this incredible cliffhanger. If after a person passes away, the soul continues to be alive, independent of the body, which has now been buried in the ground, does the soul continue to have a relationship with those that are left behind in this world? And is it possible for those that are left behind in this world to continue to have a relationship with the soul that passed on? So this is the topic. This is the question of lesson number 2. Does the soul remain connected to its loved ones it leaves behind? In order to understand the topic, we are going to explore 4 different stages that the soul goes through. Stage number 1, we're going to look at the immediate moment of passing. Stage number 2, the moment after passing and the transition of the soul from a soul that was giving life to a body to a soul that has now departed from the body. Stage number 3, we're going to look at the time of preparation for the burial, so the care of the body and the interment process. And we'll conclude with the time after burial, including the significance of visiting the grave. So we'll begin with stage number 1. We're going to focus on the moment of passing. So I open the floor to you. Here is the opening question. What happens at the moment a person passes away? What happens to the relationship between the body and the soul? Any thoughts?
Separate.
Fabulous. So Jim says, what is the definition of death from a Torah perspective, or at least from the more spiritual dimension? Very simply, it means that the soul and the body are no longer connected. They are untethered. However, that's not so simple. While there's definitely some truth to that, it's a little bit more complicated because Jewish tradition teaches us that the soul actually has 5 levels, 5 parts, 5 dimensions. And they actually are located in different places. And upon the death of the body, they go to different places. Now, for the purposes of being simple, straightforward, and concise in the class, we're only going to be talking about 2 of the 5 levels this evening. Level number 1 is called the nefesh of the soul. The nefesh is the part of the soul that gives life to and animates the physical body. This is called the nefesh. The nefesh is the difference between a person being alive and a person passing away. Really, the nefesh is the life and the existence of all the biological components of the human being. The second level of the soul is called the ruach. The ruach of the soul essentially contains the personality, the character, the nature, the emotional experiences of the human being. Now, Kabbalah teaches that each of these layers has a different destiny after the person passes away. The nefesh remains in the grave with the body. The nefesh is intimately connected to the body because the nefesh is the life of the body. So even after the person passes away, the body remains, the body exists. It doesn't poof, it doesn't disappear, it doesn't disappear into thin air. Therefore, there is a part of the soul, which is called the nefesh, that remains, stays with, and gives life to the physical existence of the body. This is called the nefesh. When the person passes away, the ruach, which is the character, the personality, the emotional component, the character, the nature of the person, that leaves the body, becomes disconnected to the body, and it ascends and goes to Gan Eden. Now, what exactly does this mean? What does it mean that there's a soul that's called the ruach, and it's not in the body anymore, and it goes, so to speak, to Gan Eden? Do we relate to that soul? Does that soul relate to us? For an answer to the question, we're going to go to a letter that was written by the Alter Rebbe, the founder of the Chabad movement, in 1788. At that point in time, the entire Hasidic movement was pretty new and had very centralized leadership. It was founded by the Baal Shem Tov. When he passed away, he was succeeded by the Magen Mizrich. When the Magen Mizrich passed away, the successor was Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Haradok. It was only after his passing that the leadership of the Hasidic movement spread out and there became localized leaders in various geographical regions. But at this point in time, centralized Hasidic leadership. So Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Haradok passes away. His students, his disciples, the Hasidim, are heartbroken. And they turn to the Alter Rebbe for guidance, and he writes them a letter of comfort. We're going to begin with text number 1a. It's on page 43 in the book. Phil, would you like to start us off? Text number 1a, page 43. Unmute yourself, go for it. It's a little bit of a long text, a few Kabbalistic phrases.
Okay. All right. Okay. As is known, the life of the tzaddik, righteous person, is not physical but spiritual. It consists of faith, reverence, and love for God. During the tzaddik's lifetime on earth, these three attributes that belong to the soul dimension of ruach are constrained within their container and garb, namely the nefesh that is bound to the corporeal body. This imposes the restraints of physical space upon these attributes. As a result, all the tzaddik's disciples receive but a glow of these ruach attributes, a mere ray that is emitted beyond the container by means of the tzaddik's holy words and thoughts. The inability to receive directly from ruach is a revelatory handicap. And therefore, our sages stated that it takes 40 years for students to fully plumb the depths of their master's teachings. By contrast, after the tzaddik's passing, the nefesh separates from the ruach and remains in the grave, while the ruach and its three attributes rise to the Gan Eden. Consequently, whoever is close to the tzaddik can receive directly from his ruach in Gan Eden because the ruach is no longer restrained in a container or confined to a physical space. There is now a straightforward path for the tzaddik's disciples to connect with the essence of their master's ruach, the faith, awe, and love with which the tzaddik served God, and not merely these attributes, outer glow that escape beyond their container. The disciples connect and receive commensurate to the degree of their loving connection and closeness to the tzaddik during his lifetime and after his death, for the transmission of all things spiritual is always by means of great love.
All right, so there's a lot to unpack in this text, although I think that many of the ideas will already be familiar to you based on lesson 1. So the Alter Rebbe makes a very important statement about the nature and the life of a tzaddik. For the tzaddik, Life is not about pizza, sushi, vacations, electronics, cars. That's not what it's about. A tzaddik's life is faith, reverence, love. A tzaddik is focused on the purpose for which he was created or she was created. The tzaddik's focus in life is mission, purpose, faith, reverence, love. The life of a tzaddik is essentially a spiritual one. During the lifetime of the tzaddik, right, the tzaddik is very limited in the tzaddik's ability to express his faith, reverence, and love, because the tzaddik is limited by the body. If the tzaddik wants to be able to speak to a person, they need to have some type of physical connection, physical relationship. However, what happens when the tzaddik passes away? Right? So when the tzaddik was alive, there need to be this physical connection for them able to express themselves. However, once the tzaddik passes away, right, the ruach of the tzaddik's soul is unleashed. Now, what do we mean when we say this? We said in last week's lesson that if the focus of a person's life is the physical and material, then when they pass away, there is a radical change. There's a radical change because their entire existence did end, is gone, because what their life was about ceased to exist. Now, if we talk about the person who lived a more spiritually focused life, who their life was spent on doing things that are eternal, so what happens when they pass away? It's not an end, right? Not only is it not an end, but their life becomes much more intense, much more deep, and much more real. Because the power of the ruach of the neshama is so deep, it's so beautiful, it's so powerful, it's so rich. And while it was in a body, it was limited and it was confined. Like one way of looking at it is the soul, as it's expressed in the body, is like a person trying to access, right, an 8K high definition stream while using a TV from like 80 years old. Right? Imagine you're taking a TV that was in one of those like huge big wooden boxes. If you remember those TVs that were like furniture pieces, like a black and white TV in a huge wooden box, and you're trying to stream on it 8K high definition in color. It can't work. It won't work, right? There's simple no mechanism for it to receive it. What you're going to get from that TV is a much more limited version of what you should be able to access. In a similar way, when the tzaddik is alive, the tzaddik is constrained by time and space. When the tzaddik passes away, the tzaddik is no longer constrained by time or space. What this means is two things. Number one, it means that a person who loved and connected to the tzaddik is now able to connect to the tzaddik in a much deeper way than he was able to before, because previously the only way that he could connect to the tzaddik was through a physical connection, which is limited to time and space. Once the tzaddik passes away, the person is able to connect to the tzaddik in the most deep and intimate way at any time and at any moment without a limitation of time and space. It may not be with a physical hug, so to speak, but it is 100% without a doubt an emotional hug, a spiritual hug. Like there's a connection to the deepest essence of the tzaddik even more powerfully than it was when the tzaddik was in fact alive. One way to look at it, right now, if you want to connect to the internet, you need to be able to have Wi-Fi. You need to be able to have a device. When a tzaddik passes away, right, not only is there Wi-Fi everywhere, but you don't even need the device to be able to tap into and to connect to the soul. So this is
can
in
I ask a
relation.
question?
Yeah, we had a question?
Yeah. So if you are connecting emotionally and you don't need this physical realm to do that, how do you know if you're connected? Like,
Uh,
is it a certain feeling? Like, how do you know that you've made this connection to the Ruach?
That's a really, really great question. And one of the most challenging things about this entire discussion. Because of the fact that the relationship that we have is on a spiritual level, right? Not on a physical, tangible level, we don't have some type of radar system that's going to be able to pick this up. But the Torah is telling us that this is the reality. The Torah tells us that the reality of a human being, it's not a body. The reality of a human being is a soul. And the soul is life itself, and the soul is eternal. And when the soul leaves the body, we lose the ability to physically connect, but we gain the ability to connect on a spiritual level much deeper than before. Because the person was limited while they were in their body, which means, number one, we were limited in how and when we could connect to them, but also as human beings, our body limits our full potential. When a person passes away, right, the soul is unleashed from the body, which means the soul is able to access its full potential. So what do I mean by that? Do you remember every single beautiful moment that you had with your father, with your mother, with your son, with your daughter? No, nobody does. It's impossible. The brain would be too overloaded to be able to recall all of this information. So yes, there are highlights that we have. But the moment a person passes away, their soul is no longer limited to the confines of the body, and every single beautiful, loving experience they had in their life shines forth in the most clear way possible. They're actually now accessing that HK, that 8K high definition stream, the sharpest picture, the most beautiful and vivid colors. So when a person is connecting to a neshama after the person passed away, it's deeper than before. It's not physical. It's not tangible. But when we project our emotions and our love, there's a very real and concrete connection. Now, Marty, it looked like you were raising your hand a little bit. Did you have a question? You just got to unmute yourself. And by the way, if anyone wants to raise their hand, I only can see 6 people on the screen at a time. So unmute yourself and go for it.
Can she see me? I don't think so. You see me?
Do you see the unmute? There should be a button that looks
Yeah.
like a microphone, a red with a dash in it, and you just got to click on that. Work on it. If you can get it, just chime in at any time, okay?
Rabbi, I got a question.
Yes, Joel.
Prior to death, does the soul leave the body at all prior to dying? Do you see any part of the soul that could contact the living? Is there anything about that?
It's a great question. I do not have any information about that at the moment. I'm not going to say yes. I'm not going to say no. I don't know. It's a good question. All right, Marty, it looks like you unmuted yourself.
Yeah, I think so.
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear. Beautiful.
All right. Well, what I'm asking, since you're making this connection with the soul of somebody who's passed, you're making this connection, are you not, with the mitigation of your physical limitations? So that the process, how do you have confidence in the validity of your connection with the past soul when you have to filter it through the imperfections and the barriers presented by your body?
I'm not sure I understand your question. I'm going to try to repeat your question to see if I'm making any sense here. how is it possible for a limited, finite human being to have a connection with a pure, infinite soul? Is that the question, or did I get it wrong?
It is can you get reliable input from that connection that you can have confidence in because of your limitations that are physical?
So the answer is absolutely. Yes. The soul is going to experience that relationship on a much deeper level than perhaps the person who's alive. Because yes, the person who's alive is going to be limited by their emotional and intellectual experience that's constrained by their body. In addition to that, we don't have the ability to sense the spiritual. But from the perspective of our loved one, from the perspective of that soul is able to experience our love in the most deep and real concrete way. When we send and express our love and connection, they pick it up, again, in the highest definition possible. Now, in terms of what we experience back, that's a whole nother story, right? That's a whole nother story, because as human beings, right, finite, limited human beings, we don't have the ability to access that back. But what I would argue is, the more you train yourself to live a more spiritually focused life, the more real and concrete the spiritual in your life will become, and the more sensitive you're going to be to spiritual things. And the relationships with people who have passed on will in turn become more intensified and more concrete and real to you as well, the more spiritually sensitive you ultimately become.
But you will eventually become so sensitive that you're already dead. In other words, if you're alive during the beginning of this process, then you cross over.
After 120 years, you will achieve maximum spiritual sensitivity. Yes, after 120 years.
Is there any communication at that time between souls?
100%, absolutely. All right, let's go to text number 1B. All right, Yossi Pearl, how would you like to read text number 1B?
It is also a matter of common sense that whatever the direct cause of the separation of the soul from the body, whether a fatal accident or a fatal illness, etc., it could affect only any of the vital organs of the physical body, but could in no way affect the spiritual soul. A further point, which is also understandable, is that during the soul's lifetime on earth, in partnership with the body, the soul is necessarily handicapped in certain respects by the requirements of the body, such as eating and drinking. Even a tzaddik whose entire life is consecrated to Hashem cannot escape the restraints of life in a material and physical environment. Consequently, when the time comes to for the soul to return home, it is essentially a release from it as it makes its ascent to a higher world, no longer restrained by a physical body and physical environment. Henceforth, the soul is free to enjoy the spiritual bliss of being near to Hashem in the fullest measure.
So there's perhaps two practical points that are a result of this idea. And number one is the significance of a yahrzeit. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time on the concept of a yahrzeit today, but definitely from the Hasidic perspective, a yahrzeit is a day that you celebrate the life of the person who passed away. Now, obviously, on the day that it happens, there's a lot more pain than there is in celebration. But when you realize that the day that the person passed away, right, their soul was unleashed and they were able to experience their full potential, their full memories, their full emotional experiences, their soul achieves an incredible ascent, it is a day to celebrate, right? It is a day to connect on a powerful and deep level. So this really does add a whole nother dimension to appreciating what a yahrzeit is all about. And I want to throw out another idea. You may agree or disagree, but I think it's very much related to this idea. Oftentimes, people find that after a loved one passes away, their negative memories fade away. They seem to fade away. The more fond memories that they have grow and become even larger. Perhaps you could say the reason for this is because the negative memories are connected and associated with everything that has to do with the body. Therefore, it does die, it does fade away, and it does disappear. All the good and positive that the soul did when it was in the body is connected to the spiritual. And after the person passes away, not only does it not fade away, but it grows, it intensifies, and becomes more powerful. And therefore, the most real memories that we have of those who we love are connected to those positive, fond, wonderful, and spiritual things and ideas. So what have we learned so far? In stage number 1, the moment of passing of the soul, is that we absolutely have a relationship, right? The relationship absolutely continues, the soul with us and us with the soul. It transitions from a physical relationship to a spiritual relationship. We're not able to give that physical hug, but we are able to give that spiritual and emotional hug. And if you really think about it, that is really what the core and the essence of a hug is. Connecting on a deep, soulful level that is absolutely possible after the person passes away. Now I'm going to show a video from Rabbi Shais Taub, formerly of Milwaukee, where he gives a beautiful metaphor to understand the connection between the soul and a person who passed away. We're going to do about half the video due to the time restrictions.
Welcome to our meditation reflection for lesson 2 of Journey of the Soul. We're going to try to visualize and relate to the idea of the continuing connection between those who are still inhabiting this world and their loved ones who have moved on. How can we visualize this connection? So I want to share with you a metaphor that was given by the Lubavitcher Rebbe to a grieving family when they lost their dear mother. The Rebbe told the family, you should know that your loved one, when they pass away, hasn't gone to some faraway place. Really, what is the situation? It's as if the whole family is together on the first floor of the house, and this loved one is in the same house with you on the second floor. So we're going to try to visualize. Again, if it helps you to close your eyes, you can close your eyes. If you want to leave your eyes open, leave your eyes open. But start to visualize in your mind's eye a loved one who's passed on. Try to imagine what it was like when you would gather and that person was physically with you. Try to remember the sights, the sounds, the whole setting. And now, imagine that exact same gathering, same setting, and that loved one who's passed on is still there with one difference. They're on the second floor. Take a moment to imagine.
All right, we're going to pause Rabbi Taub there. If you want to continue that video, again, after the class and the recap video, we'll include the rest of it. But I think the message is quite clear and quite powerful. The relationship continues. In fact, it's possible for the relationship to intensify, but it transitions from a physical relationship to a spiritual relationship. But the relationship is absolutely there in a very real and concrete way. So that's stage number one. Now we're going to move to stage number two, which is the moment after the passing of the soul and the soul's journey and the soul's transition outside of the body. So here's the question. Is death painful for the soul? We know that death is painful for the loved ones that are left behind. And we know that sometimes death can be very painful for the body. But what about the soul? Does the soul experience pain? Now, as we're going to read, the transition and the passing of a soul from the body is quite traumatic for the soul. So Jewish law has some recommendations. How should a person behave and conduct themselves when they are in the room of a person who is dying? So number one, reminiscing about good memories. Right? If you are in the room with the person who has very little amount of time, if you're in the room with the person who perhaps has lost consciousness or has lost their mental faculties, reminiscing about good memories, very healthy for the soul, very positive for the soul, comforting for the soul. Physical contact, holding their hand, right? Putting your hand on their face. These are things that are very comforting for the soul. Even just the quiet presence of a loved one is so valuable, and creating a positive and comforting atmosphere for the soul is critical as it's going on its journey. Let's go to text number 2, where we have a description from the Zohar about the soul. It's very short, so we're going to give this person not just text number 2, but a further text as well. All right, Debbie, would you like to read text number 2, and we'll give you another chance too, because it's such a short one.
Sure. Okay. A difficult farewell. Nothing is as hard for the soul as its separation from the body.
Why do you think that is? Right, the Zohar says there's nothing more difficult, right, for the soul than its separation from the body. Now, we just said that when the soul leaves the body, something fabulous takes place because it is unleashed from the confines and the shackles of the body, and it's able to experience the fullness of itself on the highest level, and that's great. Yet we also said that there's great pain and discomfort associated with the separation of the soul from the body. Why might that be? So a few answers. Number one, it's a transition. Anytime a person goes through a transition, there's going to be challenges, there's going to be difficulties. Person goes away to college, person moves out of the house, person gets a new job, person enters retirement. Well, yes, there may be some element of excitement. At the same time, it's a transition. The soul occupied that body, hopefully for decades and decades. There was a comfort level. The body was the home for that soul. The soul lived a particular type of lifestyle, it had certain goals and aspirations at the time, and now it's going to be making a transition that's uncomfortable. Another reason, which is perhaps the most powerful, is that it can't do mitzvahs anymore. We explained in lesson number 1 that the heavenly experience for the soul is more blissful and pleasurable than all of its existence on earth. However, one moment, one mitzvah on earth is much more important and much more valuable than the entire heavenly experience for the soul. So the soul, who at the moment of its passing can fully appreciate the value of what a mitzvah is, understands to the core what it's losing by not being able to do those mitzvahs, that's painful, right? That is a major, major transition for the soul. And finally, there's a powerful bond that is being broken. The soul was not just hovering over the body. The soul was integrated. The soul was enclosed. The soul was literally part of that body. There was a relationship. There was a pair there. And now that relationship is breaking up. Let's go to text number 3. And Debbie, since text number 2 was so short, you're on for text number 3 as well.
First 3 days. For 3 days, the soul hovers above the body, thinking that it can return to it. After 3 days, when it sees that the body's face has changed, it leaves the body and departs.
So the Talmud tells us that there is stage number 1. Stage number 1 is the first 3 days. The first 3 days after the soul departs the body, the soul hovers over the body. It's very much connected to the body and is having a hard time moving on because of that profound connection. It's difficult for the soul to leave the body. It hovers, it goes back and forth, it stays around. There is a transitional period. There's a certain amount of time where the soul remains very much connected to the body. Let's go to text number 4a. Marshall Mervis. You got a book? You're up for it? Text number 4a?
Sorry, I don't have the book.
You don't have the book. Okay. Jim, you have the book? Text number 4a on page 50.
For 7 days, the soul goes from the house where it lived to the grave, and from grave back to the house, and it mourns its body. After 7 days, the body is subjected to its fate, and the soul ascends to its place.
All right, we have another period of time that's mentioned, which is 7 days. During this 7-day period, the soul vacillates between the grave and its home. So the body has been buried, but the soul is still very much connected not only to the body and the grave, but to the house, its primary place of residence, the place where it lived, because again, it's very much connected to this world. All right, Brad or Marilyn Shovers, would you like to read text number 4b?
Sure, go ahead now.
Right place. 50. Which one? Text.
Text what?
4b
Okay.
on page 50.
4 and 50. Okay. 4B.
All right.
4B. For 30 days, the soul and the body are judged as one, and thus the soul is located down here on earth. After that, the soul ascends while the body erodes in the earth.
All right, now we have another period of time, which is the first 30 days after the person passes away, where the soul is still located on earth. So we go from the soul being directly over the body, then we go to the soul from the grave to the house, the grave to the house, and then in the next period of time, right, the soul is still connected to earth, but it is transitioning away from the body and transitioning away from the home. All right, text number 4c. Eileen Abrams, would you like to read? Text number 4c.
Sure. For 12 months, the body still exists, and the soul ascends and descends. After 12 months, the body becomes null, and the soul rises and no longer returns.
And then we have from the Talmud, we have a 12-month period where the soul vacillates between heaven and earth. So during this at the conclusion of this 12 months, the soul has essentially transitioned away from being part of the physical world, and it's now wholly part of the spiritual world. Now, do these numbers, do these stages remind you of anything? Do they look familiar to you? All right, Bob Gould, want to go text number 5 and refresh everyone's memories?
The Kubler-Ross stages of death, of grief. Is that what you were referring
The
to?
text number 5,
Okay.
phased mourning on page 52.
Mourners observe 3 days of weeping, 7 days of eulogies, and for 30 days restriction on haircuts and wearing freshly ironed clothing, marrying, joining a celebration of friends, and traveling on business.
So here we have a quotation from the Code of Jewish Law that describes the obligatory mourning process for the loss of a loved one. And what do we see? The process of mourning for the soul actually mirrors the journey of the soul as it departs from the body. Now, in that text, it didn't mention the 12 months, but that, of course, is a part of it as well.
Rabbi, can I ask a question?
Yes, absolutely.
I'm sure I'm missing something really obvious, but where did the 3 days come from?
So I don't have an explanation for where and how those 3 days come from, but I think it makes logical sense, especially when we talk about the 4 stages of mourning. But the Zohar certainly is reporting to us what is the spiritual reality of the soul as it transitions from the body. And there's a stage of 3 days, a stage of 7, a stage of 30, and a stage of 12. And these 3 stages of the soul are perfectly mirrored in the 4 stages of mourning. There are 4 stages of mourning that correspond to 3, 7, 30, and 12. The first 3 days is about crying, right? In the first 3 days after a person passes away, perhaps we feel the loss in the most intense way. That corresponds to the soul. The soul is hovering over the body. The soul can't even believe that it's not in the body anymore. The soul feels that departure in the most painful way. And then there's the 7-day mourning process where the pain is still felt profoundly, but the new reality you're transitioning into, and there's 7 days, right? Again, followed by 30 days and followed by 12 months. During the 4 stages of mourning, the degree of mourning lessens as you go through each stage, which perfectly mirrors the degree of the soul's struggle. As the soul, right, transitions more, struggles less, becomes more comfortable with its reality, so too the human being, right, becomes more comfortable and is able to adjust and is able to transition with the new reality. So therefore, the restrictions of mourning are different for the first 3, 7, 30, and 12 months, corresponding to the degree of the soul's struggle. And what this teaches us is something huge and something very, very powerful, which is we are not mourning for the soul, we're mourning with the soul. Right? I'm going to say it again. It's right here on the screen. We are not just mourning for the soul, but we're mourning with the soul. Because the same experience that we have as people who feel the pain and the loss of a loved one, and therefore we mourn for them, the soul is experiencing that same pain and loss from its spiritual perspective and mourns with us, joins us on that journey as well. And this helps explain an incredible story in the Talmud. This is text number 7. Andrew Cohen, you're up for it? Text number 7, page 54.
If a person dies and leaves no next of kin to be comforted, 10 people should go and sit in the deceased home. A man died in Rabbi Yehuda's neighborhood. As there were no mourners to be comforted, Rabbi Yehuda assembled 10 people every day, and they sat in the deceased's home. After 7 days, the dead man appeared to Rabbi Yehuda in a dream and said, "May your mind be at rest, for you have set my mind at rest."
Now, this is an incredibly interesting text that normally you would think, what is the significance of Shiva? The significance of Shiva and the mourning and going to the house of the mourner, is to comfort the people who are mourning. It's to comfort the people who are still alive. But what do we just learn? We're not just mourning for the soul, we're mourning with the soul. So therefore, it's incredibly valuable, it's incredibly important that Shiva should still be held in the house of the person, even if there are no relatives to mourn, even if there are no people who are obligated with the laws of mourning and Kaddish and things and so forth. It's unbelievably comforting for the soul for there to be a Shiva in the house, davening in the house of mourning, because it's not just for the soul, but it's mourning with the soul.
Luke, come here.
So what have we learned up to this point? Right, we'll get to that in a second. What I guess we've that the deceased senses our presence and appreciates it. So what have we learned about the time after the passing and the rituals that follow? They represent the fact that we maintain an incredibly deep, real, and close relationship. And again, it's a two-way relationship. It's our ability to connect with them, and it's their ability to connect with us. We are so deeply connected to the point that we truly share each other's pain during the mourning process. Any questions before we continue to stage number 3?
Yeah, this is Phil. I do have a question.
All right, yes, Phil.
Is there any change in the length of each stage depending on the age of the individual who passes away, even from the day they're born to whenever? Is there any change in that?
There is no change in that. Shiva is, when Shiva is required, Shiva is required. The only time that there's a change in the length of days is if Shiva is interrupted by a holiday. So if a person passed away in the week of a holiday, the Shiva would essentially cut off, the Shiva would be cut off by the holiday. Now, you might think that, I mean, I know that there are many people, I know Jeff Gorlick, your mother passed away before Sukkot, correct? And the Shiva was cut short as a result of Sukkot. And it's something that's very painful and difficult for the person who is not able to experience the full mourning process. But when we recognize that the mourning process is not just our own personal experience, but it's a reflection of what's happening to the soul of the person. So when we realize that if Jewish law tells us that Shiva is suspended when it's encountered by a holiday, it's because the transition of the soul to the spiritual afterlife experience is also elevated and upgraded by the holiday experience. So yes, we may feel that it's cut short, but if we remember that our Shiva experience is actually a reflection of what's happening to the soul, we appreciate that the holiday elevates that soul, calms the soul, smooths that transition. Therefore, the soul doesn't need that Shiva like it would otherwise. Right? Again, it's still hard for us to handle, but I think that this idea can help a person process the experience in a deeper way.
Rabbi, I got a question. Two of them,
Yes.
actually. Does the nefesh at any time with the ruach, and all the other 3 parts of the soul, do they all come back together at one time? Or does the nefesh always stay with the body no matter what?
So the nefesh always stays with the body until the body is totally decomposed. when the body is totally decomposed, then the nefesh itself actually splits into two. There's a part of the nefesh that ascends and rejoins the ruach, but there always is going to be some level of nefesh that is going to be within the remains of the person that passed away, because again, you can't disappear. Nothing disappears. There's always going to be something that remains within the ground. So therefore, there always is part of the nefesh and the soul. And that's going to be very relevant to our fourth stage about the visitation of the graves.
And I have one other quick question. Thank you very
Yes.
much. Now, I don't know what we believe as far as ghosts and stuff like that. People who have died, but maybe unexpectedly, shockingly, that maybe aren't even aware that they're dead. What are your thoughts on that? Or do we have any, is there something that we're going to get into too?
We probably will not get into that in this course, but if you contact me after the class, remind me, I can send you some information related to what Judaism has to say about ghosts. But I would not say that there's too much emphasis on that idea, but I could send you some information after the class.
All right, thank you.
Rabbi,
Yes,
would
Gail.
you mind sending me that information as well?
Absolutely.
Thank
Maybe
you.
I'll try to include it in the email, in the recap email. I could include a link to go to explore that direction further.
And
Right.
may I ask one other thing? Does Judaism, whereas we may refer to something as a ghost, does Judaism refer to that as a spirit?
I would not use any of this type of terminology. I think that the concept of ghosts and spirits, the way that we hear it, it's born out of a very non-Jewish way of thinking about the soul and about death. So I wouldn't use any of that terminology. But again, I'll send you a link and you can
Thank
explore
you.
that a
Yes.
little further. Yeah, no problem.
Thank
My
you very
pleasure.
much.
No problem. So now we move to stage number 3, right? Which is the preparation for the burial itself. So we've discussed what happens to the soul. Now let's turn to the body. What happens to the body at death? What happens to the body? How do we view the body? Let's go to text number 8, which is a very practical halacha, but it's going to give us a lot of insight. All right, Jeff Gorelick, would you like to read text number 8? All right, Jeff Gorelick, text number 8A. If you can unmute yourself, please. Page 55. Are you able to unmute yourself, Jeff? Not happening. It's not working. Okay. All right. Let's see. Who wants to read? All right, Vivian, please.
One who is present at the time of a person's passing is required to tear their clothing. This is because a person's passing is likened to the burning of a Torah scroll.
So the idea of tearing your clothes when the person passes away, right? You may be familiar with it, right? This is done, generally speaking, today at the funeral itself, right? That the mourners will tear their clothes, they make a bracha. It's a sign of mourning. However, the Talmud connects it, right, to tearing your clothes if a person witnessed the burning of a Torah scroll. Now, what is the connection between the burning of a Torah scroll and a person's body? Vivian, if you could read text number 8, part B as well.
Nachmanides points to the sacred names of God that are inked onto a Torah scroll's parchment as an analogy for the sacred soul that is installed within the corporeal body.
So Nachmanides, the Ramban, right, gives quite a beautiful explanation to the idea that a body is compared to a Torah scroll. Now, what is a body, right? It begins as flesh and bones. What is a Torah scroll? Right? It begins as an animal hide. But then what happens? A soul is infused into that flesh and bones. What happens to the Torah scroll? God's name is inscribed upon it. The body becomes holy just as that parchment became holy. Something that was previously the skin of an animal, by inscribing God's name on it, by inscribing the Torah on it, for now and for all time, becomes holy, becomes sacred, is treated with reverence and care, no matter the time and the circumstance. And if anything would happen to it, we would literally tear our clothes as a sign of mourning for the tragedy of what happened to that Torah. Exactly the same thing applies to a human being. Right? When the soul enters the body becomes absolutely holy. The body's holy. Even after the soul leaves, the body remains the vehicle and the vessel for all of the goodness that that soul was able to achieve, remains holy, continues to be holy, and therefore needs to be treated with the same dignity and respect as it was while I was still alive. So therefore, Jewish law has very specific instructions for how the body has to be treated after it passes away. Let's go to text number 9, right? Mitchell or Arlene, would you like to go for it? Text number 9. Unmute yourself.
Got it. All who tend to a corpse must be aware that they are handling a holy entity. The human body is more than simply a sheath to a sacred entity, a tool that serves a supernal soul. Rather, it has itself become sanctified with an independent holiness, similar to a Torah scroll.
So when a person passes away, there's a group of men for the men, and there's a group of women for the women who prepare the body for burial. They're known as the Chevra Kedisha, right? They're members of a sacred society who engage in this most holy task of preparing the holy body for burial. And Jewish law maintains various rules and regulations how to do it. The body has to be handled with respect and dignity, as you were handling a Torah scroll. You wouldn't toss it, right? You wouldn't throw it. You wouldn't be irreverent about it. You handle the body with respect and dignity. The body is cleaned and dressed in burial shrouds. There is no casual conversation that takes place around the body. The body is kept covered at all times, except for the actual moment where you're cleaning the body. The body is never placed face down, and the body is always guarded. That means there's always a person who's meant to be there with the body at all times. Let's go to text number 10. All right, Joel or Nancy Winston, would you like to go for text number 10?
Sure. We are required to maintain constant watch over a corpse, even during the daytime, and even if there is no cause to suspect that something can happen to the body. Those who maintain watch are actively performing a mitzvah to the extent that they are meanwhile absolved from many other mitzvot, such as reading the Shema and reciting the prayers at the appropriate times. We maintain a watch over the dead out of respect. For if we were to leave the body alone, it would appear as if we have abandoned it, like a utensil that we no longer require.
So these burial rites and the burial preparation is another way where we express our continued connection to our loved ones. We honor not only their souls, but we honor their body as well. And as we explained, the soul is very much connected to the body after it passes away. And when the soul sees how we treat the body that was its home for so many years, right, it is comforted and it is calmed as it sees the care, the love that we have for the body. So the soul sees the care that we have for the body, and it senses and it feels our love and respect that we have for it. Now, due to the sanctity that the body has, there is a mitzvah in the Torah that the body has to be buried. Now, this might seem like something that's very obvious, that of course Jews only bury their dead, and hopefully it's with an appreciation of the fact that we view the body of a human being as a holy entity. Unfortunately, right, cremation is on the rise. Right? 65% of Americans opt for cremation. The number is much lower amongst the Jewish community, but again, unfortunately, it's rising. Judaism teaches time and time again about the sanctity and the holiness of the body. It's not ours, it doesn't belong to us. It's a gift that's given to us by God. It's a deposit that he placed in our sacred trust, which we must care for and then return to him. Therefore, it is only respectful burial that the Torah allows, and God forbid that we should take any action to destroy, to burn, to incinerate the body. Go to text number 12 on page 61. So we'll do text 12, 13, and 14. We'll do all three texts. Let's see who has not had an opportunity to read yet. Avi, would you like to read? Text 12, 13, and 14. We're giving you a triple decker here.
Page 61, right?
Yes.
Okay. You shall surely bury him on the same day as his death.
But this, of course, tells us that we have to try to bury the person as soon as we're able, because this allows for the soul to begin its transition. When we talk about the first 3 days, we're talking about the first 3 days after burial. So the sooner you bury the person, the easier the transition is able to come. We only delay funerals if it's for the honor and the dignity of the person who passed away. So if you need to delay the funeral for a child to attend, that would be for the dignity of the person. All right, Avi, continue, please. Text number 13.
People proceed to their eternal abodes, and the mourners go about the streets. The dust returns to the earth as it was, while the spirit returns to God who bestowed it.
So the body comes from the earth, and the body is entrusted to us as a deposit. And then once again, the deposit must be returned to where it came from. And then text number 14.
For you are dust, and you will return to dust. The body comes from the earth and is entrusted as a deposit to the individual's care. Upon death, the deposit must be returned to the earth from where it came and buried there.
So returning the body to the earth allows for the natural process of the soul, right, transitioning away from the body to take place. There is a process, and we have to allow that process to take place, and it's through the natural process of burial that it's able to take place. Right? Imagine the pain that the soul experiences by witnessing its body being cremated and being burned, right? The Rebbe actually writes in a letter that the soul experiences it as if it was being burned alive. Now, I'm not trying to, to scare you. If there is a Jew that was cremated, right, because they did not know any better, it certainly cannot be held against them, right? And we know that there were millions of Jews, right, who were forcibly cremated, right, during the Holocaust, right? Surely, right, God held those souls as tightly as he possibly could during that most painful and terrible time. There's a lot more to say on the issue of cremation. A few weeks ago, maybe it was already a month or two ago, we had a lecture with Rabbi Doron Kornbluth on the topic of cremation. He explored it at great length. So I'm going to include that link in the recap email. You can watch that if you'd like to get a fuller and bigger picture on the Jewish perspective of cremation. But there's one last point that's relevant here. The idea of burying a person and rejecting cremation actually affirms many very fundamental Jewish ideas. Number one, the idea that our bodies belong to God, which means that it's not up to us to decide what we do with it. It's not up to us, right? God says it's a mitzvah to bury it, therefore we bury it, right? It's not up to us to decide what to do with the body. But number three, and perhaps most important, right? It affirms one of the 13 principles of faith is that we believe in the resurrection of the dead. One day, our body will rise up once again. This is one of the 13 fundamental principles of Jewish faith. Now, is it going to be our physical body? Of course, God is going to have to resurrect the body. But because of our faith in it, therefore, we're not going to do anything to destroy, to burn, to ruin, or to harm that body. Right, so we have a comment here from Debbie Gorman. She says, Rabbi, I've heard we're not supposed to destroy the luz bone. Do you know anything about this? Yeah, so Jewish tradition teaches that there is one bone in the body. It's a tiny bone. It's the size of like a barley corn that is indestructible, right? It's indestructible. And it's from that piece of the bone, which doesn't fully decompose, that God will recreate our body during the resurrection of the dead. Now, perhaps you could think about this from a scientific perspective, that there's always a shred of DNA that can be found somewhere that God could use to clone us in the Messianic era. So just using a little bit of modern technology to wrap our heads around this idea. All right, so what have we learned so far when it comes to stage number 3? The process of burial and the mitzvah of burial reflects the very close connection that the body has with the soul and that the soul has with the body. All right, now we go to stage number 4. Right? What happens after burial? And how does this relate to visiting the grave? So is it a Jewish thing to visit the grave? Is that like a Jewish thing to do, to go to the cemetery, to visit people? Absolutely. Now, you remember at the beginning of the class, we talked about the fact that after a person passes away, the ruach may separate and disconnect from the body, but the nefesh absolutely stays connected with the body. What this means is we're not just visiting the burial place of the body, we're visiting the nefesh of the soul as well. All right, let's go to Debbie Gorman, text number 16, please.
Okay, text 16. Evoking the soul's empathy. The nefesh remains present in the grave. Due to the fact that it remains among the living, it is acquainted with their pain. At their time of need, it pleads with God for mercy on their behalf. When the inhabitants of the world are in need, when they are in sorrow and visit the cemetery, the nefesh is aroused to their plight. It ascends and awakens the ruach, which in turn entreats God for mercy. Consequently, the Holy One, blessed be He, has mercy on the world.
When a person visits the grave, they're not just visiting bones, flesh. That's not what they're visiting. They're actually visiting the person. The nefesh, part of the soul, is actually there. Which is why when we go to the grave of a tzaddik, we say we're actually at a holy location, right? Not just because the body is there, but because the soul is there as well. It feels it, it relates it, it connects to it. So when we visit the grave, right, the nefesh is present among the living and therefore feels the pain. When people visit the grave, the nefesh is aroused. The nefesh awakens the ruach, and the ruach actually entreats God. Let's go to text number 17. Right, Pamela, would you like to read text number 17? Page 67.
There once was a community that wished to relocate. One of the deceased buried in the vicinity appeared in a dream to a member of the community and pleaded, "Please do not abandon us, for we appreciate your visits to the cemetery." Barzillai the Gileadite declared, "I would like to die in my own city." He wished for this because the deceased appreciate when their loved ones visit the graves and request goodness for their souls. This improves their condition in heaven. And when we pray on behalf of the deceased, they pray for us in turn.
There's tremendous value in visiting a grave, and there's a tremendous value in being buried near where you have family that lives there, which is going to give you the greatest opportunity for people to come and visit your grave. So what are some of the benefits? Number one, it reflects a tremendous respect for the departed. It lets them know that their memory has not been forgotten. It reinforces our continuous connection. The dead absolutely appreciates the visit, right? The connection is mutual. We're talking about a two-sided experience. And there are special days that were meant to visit the grave. Jewish tradition says that, of course, on the yahrzeit, you visit the grave. Before Rosh Hashanah, before Yom Kippur, right? Before holidays, we visit the grave. Before monumental special occasions, before a wedding, right? Before a bar mitzvah, before things of the nature, we go to celebrate it, to commemorate it, to invite, right, our relatives to these special occasions. We know there's a Jewish custom that when you go to a cemetery and you visit a grave, you put a stone, you put a rock on the grave. Now, why do we do this? Number one, it's a sign that the person is remembered and that the person still has a presence and impacts the world. There's a physical stone that builds up over time. There's an actual monument to the presence of the person in the world. And we're also making its statement that just as that stone exists eternally, so to speak, so too does our loved one remain and exist and affect us eternally as well. So visiting the grave strengthens the bond and the love between the living and the one who's passed. The soul sees our actions. The soul feels the love that we have for them. It's an intense connection which remains, again, long after the person's passing. And again, it works both ways. We desire to connect and are able to connect with our loved ones. And our loved ones desire to connect with us and are able to pray on our behalf. So we began the class with this fundamental question: do we remain connected with those that we left behind? Is the soul able to connect to us? And of course, the answer is a resounding yes. The soul remains very much connected after death. We to them and them to us. So what does this mean for us on a practical level? There's no need to worry or to wonder. After a person passes away, you will still see, you will still remain connected to the people that you left behind, and you will be able to pray for them on their behalf, and you'll be able to impact them. And similarly, for those who remain physically alive in this world, there is a responsibility for us not to forget our loved ones, but to remain connected to them in the deepest possible way. How do we do that? By connecting to the things that were the most important to them when they were alive. Like if we follow in their footsteps, if we embrace what they were passionate about, what they were excited about, what they lived for, right, then we remain connected to them in the deepest possible way, because after all, in death, we are not separated. Now, I want to conclude with something that's actually quite personal. In 1953, December 31st, my great-grandfather, who was a rabbi in Boston, was murdered. This is an excerpt from the New York Times. It says, Boston, January 1st, Rabbi Jacob Zuber, 54 years old, a Jewish scholar who immigrated to this country from Europe in 1947. He was actually the chief rabbi of Stockholm, Sweden for 18 years. Right? My grandmother was 3 when she moved to Sweden and grew up there. He died today in a Boston City hospital, apparently the victim of a beating by hoodlums in a lonely public park in the Roxbury district. The people were never found, right? My grandmother was pregnant with my father at the time, and my father is named after him. Now, my grandmother's sister, right, was going through a very difficult time. Within a 5-year period, her father died, was murdered. Her mother died shortly afterwards, and then her mother-in-law passed away. So in 1958, she writes a letter to the Lubavitcher Rebbe describing the pain, the grieving that she's been going through in a nonstop way. She's a young woman in her early 20s, loses her father, loses her mother, loses her mother-in-law. Text number 18 is the letter's response to my grandmother's sister. This is a picture of my great-grandfather, Rabbi Zuber, and I'm not sure if the picture is either my grandmother or it's her sister, right? I'm not sure, and this picture is in Stockholm, Sweden. So this is my grandfather who was murdered, unfortunately, at the age of 54 in 1953. So please follow along with me. I'm going to read this text, page 68. The Rebbe again writes to my grandmother's sister. Blessing and greeting. I received your undated letters in which you write about your emotional upsets in connection with the passing of your mother and the questions which are troubling you in this connection, involving also questions in regard to the passing of your father, peace unto him. Now, this is actually quite a long letter, and there's a section that is missing here from the text because it would make it longer. So the letter skips ahead. Another fundamental point to remember, which has a direct bearing on your letter, is that all believers in God believe also in the survival of the soul. Actually, this principle has even been discovered in this physical world, where science now holds as an absolute truth that nothing in the physical world can be absolutely destroyed. How much more so in the spiritual world, especially in the case of the soul, which in no way can be affected by the death and disintegration of the physical body. It would be silly and illogical to assume that because a certain organ of the body ceases to function, affecting other physical organs of the body, the spiritual soul will also be affected thereby. The truth is that when the physical body ceases to function, the soul continues its existence, not only as before, but even on a higher level, inasmuch as it no longer handicapped by the restraints of the physical frame. Thirdly, the attachment of children to their parents and the general attachment between close relatives during life on this earth is surely not a physical attachment by the respective physical bodies of the relatives. Essentially, the attachment is a spiritual one, due to the spiritual affinity between those concerned and the qualities of the soul, including such spiritual things as character, kindness, goodness, etc., all of which are attributes of the soul and not the body. Therefore, also every action on the part of a person in relation to a beloved person and the desire to benefit that person is not directed towards pleasing his physical body, his bone and tissue, for it is the spiritual pleasure that one is connected with. In view of the above, it is clear that even after the physical body has disintegrated and disappeared from view, it is still possible to bring joy and benefit to the soul which as noted above, not only survives, but does so on a higher level. And all the things which had previously brought joy and pleasure to one's parents will continue to do so even after they are physically no longer here. And I know that this letter brought a tremendous amount of comfort to my aunt, and I hope it will do so for all of you as well.
Lesson 2. Taking leave. 1. Nefesh and Ruach are two of the soul's components. After death, the Nefesh remains with the body, while the Ruach disengages and ascends to Gan Eden, paradise. 2. Once the Ruach is no longer limited to material existence, it's more accessible to all who wish to connect to it. Thus, when a person dies, our ability to spiritually connect with him or her is stronger and deeper than before. 3. Though the Nefesh remains in the grave, it retains a connection with the higher levels of the soul. The gravesite is thus a portal where we can communicate with departed souls and ask them to intercede before God on our behalf. 4. Over the course of a lifetime, the soul and body integrate and bond. Their separation at death is therefore painful for the soul. 5. The soul departs the body in stages. These stages correspond to the prescribed periods of mourning. When we mourn, we are mourning not only for the deceased, but also with the deceased. 6. Dignity and sensitivity are the underlying principles that guide the care of a corpse and its preparation for burial. This is because even after death, the body retains its special status of having been the container for the soul. 7. Burial is of highest priority in Jewish tradition and culture. When God takes a person's soul, we are tasked to return the body to the place from which God fashioned it. 8. Burial affirms two fundamental Jewish beliefs. A. Our bodies aren't ours. They belong to God. And B. There will be a resurrection of the dead in the Messianic era.
Right, next week's class, right, we're going to discuss how when a person passes away, right, it's quite painful, right? And there's a natural stages of grief that a person experiences, and we're going to discuss how Jewish law, right, provides a very healthy grieving process that is quite sensitive to the experience of both body and soul, right? So that's next week, lesson number 3, the morning after. And to continue learning, go to myjli.com/soul. Although there's another link that's myjli.com/journey. So I gotta make sure which is the correct one. We'll have more videos, lectures, and content about this material. When I send the recap email, I'll send some information about ghosts, and I'll post that lecture about cremation as well. So now I'm going to stop the recording, and the floor will be open for any questions that you might have. So thank you so much for joining us for lesson number 2.